November 1943, Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. The thick jungle air hung heavy with moisture and death. Sergeant Jack Campbell crouched behind a fallen tree, his fingers wrapped around something his commanding officers had laughed at just 3 weeks earlier, a bow. A simple wooden bow with a 65-pound draw weight, crafted from Queensland hardwood back home in Australia. They had called it primitive, they had called it a toy. They had told him real soldiers used rifles, not weapons from the Stone Age, but Jack knew something they didn't. In this green hell, where every sound could mean death, silence was worth more than all the bullets in the world. The numbers told a story that nobody wanted to hear. Out of every 10 Australian commando patrols sent into the Bougainville jungle, 6 men never came back. 60%. The math was simple and brutal. The Japanese had turned this island into a fortress, with sentries posted every 50 meters along their supply routes. The dense jungle made it impossible to see more than 20 feet in any direction. The humidity made everything stick to your skin. The heat never stopped, even at night, and the mosquitoes were so thick you could barely breathe without swallowing one. But none of that killed as many men as a single rifle shot. Every time an Australian patrol fired their weapon, the sound ripped through the jungle like thunder. 400 meters in every direction, Japanese soldiers heard it. Within seconds, they were moving. Within minutes, they had the Australians surrounded. The jungle that hid the commandos also trapped them. There was nowhere to run when the enemy knew exactly where you were. Patrol after patrol went out. Patrol after patrol got cut down. The rifles that were supposed to protect the soldiers had become death sentences. Jack had watched it happen too many times. Good men, trained soldiers, went into that jungle with the best weapons the army could give them. They came back in body bags, or they didn't come back at all. The officers kept sending them out anyway. They kept saying the same things. This is war. This is what soldiers do. Use your rifles. Follow your training. Don't question orders. But Jack had questioned everything since he was a boy back in Queensland, where he'd spent every weekend in the bush with a bow in his hands, hunting deer and wild pigs, where he'd learned that the best hunters weren't the loudest or the fastest. They were the quietest. His commanding officer, Major Henderson, had seen the bow when Jack first arrived at the base camp. The Major's face had turned red. He'd pointed at it and laughed so hard the other soldiers stopped what they were doing to watch. A bow and arrows. In 1943. In the middle of a modern war. Henderson had called it insulting. He'd said Jack was treating the Japanese like they were animals to be hunted. He'd said only cowards used silent weapons because they were too scared to fight like real men. The other officers had nodded. They'd agreed. Guns were civilized. Guns were what separated modern armies from savages. Never mind that the guns were getting everyone killed. Jack had tried to explain it once. He'd shown them the math. A rifle shot could be heard 400 meters away. That meant every Japanese soldier in a circle covering more than 50 acres knew exactly where you were. The sound bounced off the trees. It echoed. It told the enemy not just where you were, but how many of you there were and what kind of weapons you had. One shot, and you just painted a target on your back that every enemy soldier could see. But a bow made no sound except a whisper of air. The arrow flew at 200 feet per second. By the time it hit its target, there was nothing to hear except a body falling. No echo, no warning. No circle of death spreading out from your position. Major Henderson had cut him off. He'd said that Jack was wasting everyone's time with fairy tales. Modern warfare didn't work that way. The Japanese had machine guns and grenades and mortars. What good was a bow against that? Jack had wanted to say that you never faced machine guns if the enemy didn't know where you were, but he'd learned to keep his mouth shut. The army didn't reward men who challenged their superiors, even when those superiors were sending men to die. 3 days ago, another patrol had gone out. 8 men, all of them carrying rifles, all of them following the same tactics that had failed 20 times before. They'd been gone less than 4 hours when the shooting started. The sound of gunfire rattled through the base camp. Then silence. Then nothing. The rescue team found 5 bodies. The other 3 were never found. 60% casualties. Right on schedule. That night, Jack had sat in his tent and stared at his bow. He'd made a decision that could get him court-martialed or worse. But he'd rather face a firing squad than watch one more good man die because somebody thought silence was primitive. The next morning, he'd stood in front of Lieutenant Colonel James Pearson, the only officer who'd ever listened to him without laughing. Jack had laid out everything. The casualties, the sound radius, the tactical advantage of silent kills. Pearson had listened without interrupting. Then he'd done something Jack never expected. He'd said yes. Not officially, not in writing, but yes. One mission. Prove it works, or go back to using a rifle like everyone else. Jack had nodded. One mission was all he needed. One mission to show them that sometimes the oldest weapons were the deadliest. One mission to prove that, in the jungle, the man who makes no sound is the man who survives. Jack's bow wasn't like the ones you'd see in a sporting goods store back in Sydney. This was a recurve design, built specifically for one purpose: killing quickly and quietly at 40 meters or less. The limbs curved away from him at the tips, storing more energy than a straight bow ever could. When he pulled back the string, it took 65 pounds of force to draw it to full anchor. Most men couldn't hold that draw for more than a few seconds. Jack had been doing it since he was 12 years old. His arrows weren't sporting arrows either. He'd modified each broadhead himself, filing the edges until they could slice through a 1-inch rope with a single pass. The shafts were made from Port Orford cedar, each one weighing exactly 400 grains. Too light, and they'd be blown off course by the slightest breeze. Too heavy, and they'd drop too fast. 400 grains was perfect. The practice range Lieutenant Colonel Pearson had set up wasn't much. Just a cleared section of jungle about 50 meters long, with targets made from sandbags and painted canvas. Pearson had brought 3 other officers to watch. None of them believed this would work. Jack could see it in their faces. They stood with their arms crossed, waiting for him to fail so they could get back to real military business. Jack didn't say anything. He just nocked an arrow and waited for Pearson to give the signal. The first target sat 40 meters away. Pearson raised his hand and dropped it. Jack drew, anchored at the corner of his mouth, and released in one smooth motion. The bow made a sound like a sharp breath. That was it. Just a whisper of air. The arrow hit the target dead center, punching through the canvas and burying itself 6 inches into the sandbag behind it. One of the officers checked his watch. The whole thing had taken less than 2 seconds from draw to impact. Jack nocked another arrow. 4 seconds later, a second arrow hit 2 inches from the first. 4 seconds after that, a third arrow completed a tight group you could cover with your hand. The officers weren't laughing anymore. They were staring at the target, then at Jack, then back at the target. Pearson walked over to examine the arrows. He tried to pull one out and had to use both hands. When it finally came free, he held it up to the light. The broadhead had mushroomed from the impact, the edges still razor-sharp despite punching through heavy canvas and sand. But Major Henderson still wasn't convinced. He'd come to the demonstration late, arriving just as Jack finished his grouping. Henderson walked right past the impressed officers and stood directly in front of Jack. He said the test proved nothing. Any soldier could hit a stationary target at 40 meters with a rifle. The real question was whether Jack could do it under pressure, in the dark, with an enemy that shot back. Henderson said he wouldn't authorize the use of medieval weapons in his command based on target practice. Then he turned and walked away. Pearson watched him go. Then he looked at Jack and said something that changed everything. He said that officially, Henderson was right. They couldn't authorize experimental weapons without proper field testing. But unofficially, if Jack wanted to carry his bow on tomorrow's reconnaissance patrol, Pearson wouldn't stop him. He wouldn't order it, he wouldn't put it in the mission report, but he wouldn't stop it. Jack understood immediately. If the mission succeeded, Pearson would take credit for innovative thinking. If it failed, Jack would take all the blame. November 18th, 1943. 0400 hours. Jack moved through the jungle with 5 other men. They were headed to a Japanese supply route 3 kilometers from base camp. Intelligence said the enemy moved supplies through that area every morning just after dawn. The patrol's job was to observe and report. Nothing more. But Jack had his bow strapped across his back, and he had 12 arrows in the quiver on his hip. The other soldiers carried rifles, but they'd been ordered to maintain radio silence unless absolutely necessary. No shooting unless they were compromised. The jungle at 4 in the morning was a different world. The darkness was so complete you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. They moved by feel, stepping carefully to avoid snapping branches that would give away their position. The sounds were different too. The daytime insects had gone quiet. Now you heard frogs, night birds, and things moving through the undergrowth that you couldn't identify and didn't want to. The air was cooler, but still humid enough that sweat soaked through their uniforms within minutes. They reached the supply route at 05:15, just as the sky started to lighten. The path was nothing fancy, just a trail beaten down by hundreds of boots and supply carts. But it was clear enough that you could see 30 meters in either direction once the sun came up. Jack and his team set up in the dense foliage 20 meters from the trail. They had a perfect view and perfect cover. Now they waited. At 0540, the first Japanese sentry appeared. He was walking slowly, rifle slung over his shoulder, clearly bored with his assignment. He passed within 15 meters of Jack's position without seeing anything. 2 minutes later, a second sentry followed, then a third. They were spaced about 50 meters apart, exactly as intelligence had reported. Between the sentries came the supply carriers, Japanese soldiers hauling boxes of ammunition and food on their backs. There were at least 30 men in the column. If Jack's team had opened fire with rifles, they might have killed 3 or 4 before the rest of them returned fire and wiped out the entire patrol. But Jack wasn't thinking about firing rifles. He was watching the third sentry, a Japanese sergeant who'd stopped to light a cigarette. The man was 35 meters away, standing perfectly still as he cupped his hands around the match. Jack slowly reached back and drew an arrow from his quiver. The other soldiers watched him, their eyes wide. They'd heard about the bow, but none of them had seen it used. Jack waited until the sergeant took his first drag on the cigarette. Then he drew, anchored, and released. The arrow covered 35 meters in less than a fifth of a second. It hit the sergeant in the chest, right below the collarbone, and punched completely through his body. The sergeant dropped without making a sound. His rifle clattered against a rock as he fell. Jack knocked another arrow and counted. 4 seconds. One of the supply carriers heard the rifle hit the ground and looked over. He saw the sergeant lying motionless and started to call out. Jack's second arrow caught him in the throat. The man went down, his shout turning into a wet gurgle that never got loud enough to alert anyone else. 4 seconds. The supply column kept moving, completely unaware that 2 of their men had just died 20 meters behind them. Jack's team observed for another hour, gathering intelligence on Japanese supply routes and troop movements. Then they disappeared back into the jungle without firing a single rifle shot. When they returned to base camp, every man was alive. The mission was a complete success. Pearson didn't say much when Jack reported in. He just nodded once and told Jack to keep the bow ready. There would be more patrols. More opportunities to prove that silence was survival. The mission that made Jack Campbell a legend happened 6 days later, November 24th, 1943. Dawn Patrol. The sky was just starting to turn grey when Jack and his team spotted something that made every man freeze in place. 6 Japanese sergeants were gathered in a small clearing, smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices. They'd stopped to rest before continuing their morning inspection of the defensive positions. They were bunched together, standing in a loose circle, maybe 10 feet across. Their rifles were slung over their shoulders. They felt safe this deep in their own territory. They had no idea that death was watching them from 30 meters away. Jack's team leader looked at him and nodded. This was it. 6 high-value targets. If they could eliminate these sergeants without raising an alarm, the Japanese defensive command in this sector would be chaos for days. But there was no way to do it with rifles. 1 shot, and the entire garrison would come running. Jack unslung his bow and counted his arrows. He had 8 left. He'd need 6, maybe 7 if he missed. He couldn't miss. The first sergeant flicked his cigarette into the dirt and stretched. Jack drew his bow, feeling the familiar tension in his shoulders and back, 65 pounds pulling against his muscles. He anchored at the corner of his mouth, the string touching his nose and lips. The first sergeant was talking to another man, gesturing with his hands. Jack exhaled slowly and released. The bowstring snapped forward with that soft whisper of air. The arrow flew straight and true, hitting the sergeant in the side of his chest. The man's knees buckled and he went down without a sound, collapsing onto the jungle floor. 4 seconds. Jack already had the second arrow knocked. The other sergeants were still talking. They hadn't noticed their companion fall. The morning light was dim enough that the first man just looked like he was sitting down. Jack picked his second target, a tall sergeant who was lighting another cigarette. Draw, anchor, release. The arrow took him in the neck. He dropped his cigarette and grabbed at his throat, but no sound came out except a wet gurgle. He fell backward, crashing into the brush. 4 seconds. Now the other 4 sergeants realized something was wrong. They saw 2 men down, they saw blood, but they didn't know where the attack was coming from. No gunshots, no explosions. Just 2 of their friends suddenly dead on the ground. One of them started to unsling his rifle. Jack's third arrow caught him in the chest before the rifle cleared his shoulder. The sergeant spun halfway around and hit the ground face first. 4 seconds. 3 men left. They were panicking now, looking in every direction, trying to figure out what was happening. One of them opened his mouth to shout a warning. Jack's fourth arrow went through his open mouth and out the back of his neck. The shout became a choking sound that died with him. 4 seconds. 2 men left. They had finally spotted the general direction the arrows were coming from. One of them raised his rifle and fired blindly into the jungle. The shot went wide, hitting a tree 15 feet from Jack's position. But now, the damage was done. That rifle shot would bring every Japanese soldier within 400 meters. Jack drew his fifth arrow. The sergeant who'd fired was trying to work the bolt on his rifle for a second shot. Jack's arrow hit him in the stomach and punched through to his spine. The man collapsed. 4 seconds. 1 sergeant left. He was running now, sprinting toward the trail to raise the alarm. If he made it, Jack's entire team would be dead within minutes. Jack tracked him with his bow, leading the target, calculating the range and the speed. 40 meters now. 45. The man was fast. Jack drew, held his breath, and released. The arrow covered the distance in a fraction of a second and took the running sergeant in the back. He stumbled, tried to keep running, and fell forward into the dirt. He didn't get up. Jack looked at his watch. 55 seconds from first arrow to last. 6 men dead. The only sound had been that single rifle shot from the panicked sergeant, and it had come too late for him to do any good. Jack's team moved quickly, disappearing back into the jungle before reinforcements could arrive. They made it back to base camp by 0900 hours. When Jack reported what had happened, Lieutenant Colonel Pearson just stared at him for a long moment. Then he said 3 words that changed everything. Make more bows. The numbers told the story better than any speech could. Before Jack started using his bow, Australian commando patrols had a 40% success rate. That meant 6 out of every 10 patrols either failed their mission or got wiped out trying. After Jack's demonstration, after other soldiers started learning to use bows for silent elimination, the success rate jumped to 87%. Same jungle, same enemy, same dangerous conditions. The only difference was the weapon. Silence saved lives. Within 2 weeks, 12 more commandos came to Jack asking him to teach them. He started holding training sessions every evening after regular duty hours. The soldiers who showed up weren't the ones you'd expect. They weren't the biggest or the strongest. They were the patient ones, the careful ones, the ones who understood that in the jungle, staying alive mattered more than looking tough. Jack showed them how to judge distance, how to compensate for wind and humidity, how to aim by instinct instead of by sight. Most importantly, he taught them that killing wasn't about anger or hatred. It was about precision and timing, and never hesitating when the moment came. The Japanese noticed the change too, though they didn't understand what was causing it. Sentries started dying without any gunshots being heard. Guards would be at their posts one moment and gone the next, found hours later with arrows through their bodies. The Japanese command increased the distance between sentries from 50 meters to 80 meters. They started requiring sentries to check in with each other every 10 minutes instead of every 30. They posted extra guards at night. None of it helped. Jack and his team of bow-armed commandos could eliminate a target at 40 meters and be gone before anyone realized what had happened. But not everyone in the Allied command was impressed. Major Henderson remained Jack's biggest opponent. He filed 3 separate reports calling the use of bows unsportsmanlike and uncivilized. He said that modern armies shouldn't use weapons that belonged in museums. He argued that it gave the Japanese propaganda ammunition, letting them claim that the Australians were savages who couldn't fight like real soldiers. Some of the British officers agreed with him. They said there were rules in war, and sneaking around with silent weapons violated the spirit of honourable combat. Jack heard these complaints and couldn't believe what he was hearing. Honourable combat. The Japanese weren't worried about honour when they tortured prisoners. They weren't thinking about sportsmanship when they booby-trapped the bodies of dead Australian soldiers. War wasn't a game with rules. It was about survival. And if using a bow instead of a rifle meant more Australian soldiers went home alive, Jack didn't care what anyone called it. The psychological impact on Japanese troops became obvious by mid-December. Prisoners captured during raids talked about the invisible killers. They said their sergeants were terrified of morning patrols. They said some guards refused to be posted alone because they'd heard stories about men who died silently, killed by arrows that came from nowhere. The fear was real, and it spread through the Japanese ranks like a disease. Soldiers started abandoning their posts. Officers had trouble maintaining discipline, all because of a wooden bow and a man who knew how to use it. Suppressed firearms did exist in 1943, but they were rare and unreliable. Even with the best suppressor technology, a silenced rifle was still 15 times louder than a bow. In the humid jungle air, where sound carried differently and metal parts rusted within days. Those suppressors failed constantly. Jack's bow never failed. It never jammed. It never ran out of ammunition as long as he could retrieve his arrows. And it never, ever made enough noise to give away his position. Sometimes, the old ways really were the best ways. The war in the Pacific ended on August 15th, 1945. Jack Campbell came home to Queensland 3 months later, carrying the same bow that had made him a legend in the jungles of Bougainville. He never talked about what he'd done during the war. When people asked, he just said he'd served with the commandos and left it at that. The bow went into a closet in his small house outside Brisbane. It stayed there for the next 30 years, gathering dust while the world moved on and forgot that silent weapons had once saved hundreds of lives. The official military records barely mentioned Jack's contribution. There was no medal ceremony, no newspaper articles, no recognition from the government. The after-action reports from Bougainville mentioned improved patrol success rates, but never explained why the numbers had changed. The use of bows was classified information, buried in files that nobody would see for decades. The military didn't want to admit that one of their most effective weapons in the Pacific theater had been a piece of bent wood and some sharpened arrows. It didn't fit the narrative of modern warfare and technological superiority, so they simply didn't talk about it. But the soldiers who'd been there remembered. The men who'd survived because Jack's bow had kept them hidden from the enemy, they knew what had happened. They told their children and grandchildren about the silent killer who'd turned the tide in the jungle. The story spread quietly, passed down through families, changing a little with each telling but keeping the essential truth intact. One man with a primitive weapon had proven that sometimes the old ways worked better than the new ways. Sometimes, silence mattered more than firepower. Lieutenant Colonel James Pearson retired from the military in 1952. Before he left, he wrote a detailed report about the use of archery in special operations. He sent copies to the Australian Defence Force, the British Special Air Service, and the American Office of Strategic Services. Most of the copies ended up in filing cabinets, unread and forgotten. But a few people paid attention. A few people understood that Pearson wasn't just telling war stories, he was describing a tactical approach that could still be useful in the modern world. The 1960s brought a new kind of warfare. Vietnam. Dense jungle, an enemy that knew the terrain better than the soldiers hunting them. American and Australian special forces faced the same problems Jack had faced 20 years earlier. Rifle fire gave away positions. Helicopter insertions announced their arrival to everyone within miles. They needed ways to operate silently, to eliminate targets without alerting the entire enemy force. Someone remembered Pearson's report. Someone dug it out of the archives and started asking questions. By 1968, Special Forces units were experimenting with crossbows and compound bows for specific missions. The technology had improved since Jack's day. Modern bows were lighter, stronger, more accurate. But the principle remained exactly the same. Silence was survival. A target eliminated without sound was a tactical advantage that no amount of advanced weaponry could match. The military still didn't advertise this training. They didn't issue press releases about teaching elite soldiers to use medieval weapons, but they did it anyway, because it worked. Jack found out about it in 1973, when a young army officer showed up at his door asking questions. The officer's name was Lieutenant Marcus Webb, and he was part of a new program training special forces in unconventional warfare techniques. Webb had read Pearson's report, which had finally been declassified along with thousands of other World War II documents. He wanted to know if Jack would be willing to talk about his experiences. Jack invited him in, made tea, and spent 6 hours describing everything he'd learned in the jungles of Bougainville. Webb took detailed notes. He asked about draw weight, arrow design, effective range in different weather conditions, and the psychological aspects of using a silent weapon. Jack answered every question, pulling his old bow out of the closet and demonstrating techniques he hadn't used in almost 30 years. His hands still remembered the movements. His muscles still knew the feel of drawing back that 65-pound string. By the end of the day, Webb had enough information to completely revise his training program. He asked Jack if he'd be willing to come teach at the Special Forces School. Jack said no. He'd spent enough time at war, but he gave Webb permission to use anything from their conversation. The training program Webb developed became standard practice for Australian and Allied Special Forces by 1975. Soldiers learned to use bows not as their primary weapon, but as a specialized tool for specific situations. Night operations, close-range elimination of sentries. Missions where complete silence was required. The success rate of these operations was remarkably high, just as it had been in Bougainville. The lesson had finally been learned. Sometimes technology wasn't the answer. Sometimes you needed to go backward to move forward. Jack died in 1998 at the age of 76. His obituary in the Brisbane newspaper mentioned that he'd served in World War II, but gave no details. 300 people came to his funeral, including 12 former commandos who'd served with him, and 27 active-duty Special Forces soldiers who'd never met him, but had been trained using the techniques he'd pioneered. They didn't give speeches or tell stories. They just stood quietly in the back of the church, paying respects to a man who'd understood something important about warfare that most people never learned. Today, every major Special Forces unit in the world includes some form of silent weapons training. The equipment has changed. Modern compound bows can shoot accurately at 80 meters instead of 40. Carbon fiber arrows fly faster and straighter than Jack's cedar shafts ever did. Night vision equipment and laser rangefinders have made the weapons even more effective. But the basic principle Jack proved in 1943 remains unchanged. In certain situations, silence is the most powerful weapon a soldier can carry. The story of Jack Campbell and his primitive Aussie bow teaches us something important about innovation and human nature. We assume that progress always moves forward, that new is always better than old, that advanced technology will always beat simple solutions. But that's not always true. Sometimes the most effective answer to a modern problem is an ancient solution that everyone dismissed as outdated. The key is knowing when to use which tool and having the courage to go against popular opinion when the situation demands it. Jack succeeded not because he rejected modern weapons, but because he understood their limitations. He didn't say rifles were useless. He said they were the wrong tool for a specific job. That kind of thinking requires wisdom, not just knowledge. It requires the ability to look past what everyone else is doing and ask whether there might be a better way. In 1943, everyone knew that modern soldiers used guns. Jack asked why. That simple question and his willingness to challenge the answer saved hundreds of lives. The lesson applies far beyond warfare. In business, education, medicine, and every other field, we often assume that the newest approach is automatically the best approach. We chase innovation for its own sake, forgetting that old methods sometimes survive for good reasons. The challenge is learning to recognize when tradition has value and when it's just holding us back. Jack Campbell figured that out in a jungle on the other side of the world, armed with nothing but a bow and the courage to trust his own judgment. In the end, the story of the primitive Aussie bow isn't really about archery or warfare. It's about the importance of questioning assumptions, trusting your own experience, and understanding that sometimes the most advanced technology in the world can't compete with simple solutions applied with skill and intelligence. Technology without wisdom is just noise. And in war, as in life, noise can kill you.